Well, greetings. This is Dr. Dean Blevins, and I just wanted to say welcome to this very brief, hopefully brief, presentation for a Wesleyan vision for technology. Or one way to think about it is how Wesley's theology engages technology would be one approach within this. Now, if you've noted in the class, I'm not tended to stress one theological posture over others, partially because I think the field of theology and technology warrants, multiple theological conversations from different perspectives. And so I've tried to leave it open so that you could bring some of your own sort of theological understandings into the class. But since Nazarene Theological Seminary is anchored within the Wesleyan tradition, and that since that has also been an important contributor to my own understanding of theology, and particularly even theology and technology, I thought it would be wise to provide this overview and then a set of readings that you can do at a later time that sort of resource what I'm about to present. Well, to begin, when you talk about Wesley, one thing you have to understand is that to some extent, Wesley, like his contemporaries, borrowed from the technology of his day. And that would include, yes, a printing press. It's an interesting period in England in the 18th century in how a lot of printing was done extempore, particularly through what we would call pamphleteering. Now, it's not quite like using Facebook or TikTok, though at least the idea that one's independent thoughts could be circulated, albeit in their days, inexpensively, by approaching a printer on say a printer's row and taking your writing, have it converted to movable type, and then printing up a number of broadsheets, which would probably usually be one or two sheets of paper together. A lot of times they might be front and back just so you can circulate it much like we would a pamphlet today. But then knowing that when you do that, that those written efforts often then got replicated through publications like newspapers and magazines, so that this was a way to maybe offer your first hashtag challenge, or another way to say it is to get the first tweet out and hope up that the news agencies will pick it up. That was actually happening even in Wesley's day. Also, Wesley was very much focused on providing other kinds of print resources. His journals, if you ever have a chance to look at the bicentennial edition and look at the introduction, Wesley not only wrote journals for his own personal use, but his publication of journals really were quite intentional to communicate something about an apologetic for his own journey, basically a kind of snapshot of an apologetic for the people called Methodists, particularly in that era of England when a lot of times new movements were looked on with deep suspicion after 200 years of battle between sort of different, and I'll use the word factions, but you might call these denominations or traditions, battling over the control of the church through the power of the state. It's not surprising that Wesley felt the need to publish the journals to kind of explain to people of Methodist. And the third one, to which I've written about in a couple of places, is also to lift up the experiences of the Methodist people. And so journals were very important for Wesley in communicating, as well as the standard sermons that you hear about. Actually, that predates Wesley, that there was a tendency beginning with the court of James to circulate royal sermons, sermons that were preached at court to local parishes for two reasons. One was to, in some sense, secure good, sound theology with parish ministers who often didn't have a lot of theological education, but also then to communicate the intent of not only true theology, but at times how that true theology supported the state church. And there's some interesting stories around that. But at least Wesley was actually borrowing what I would call the communication forms of his era, including just the everyday and ordinary use of print technology to actually both encourage, explicate, and defend the people called Methodists as part of his own journey. And it should be a reminder of us, those of us who are working in digital media and social media, that Wesley in his day probably were mirroring practices that would not be that much different than our day alone. However, probably even more important for our conversation was Wesley's sort of interest in electricity and how electricity might be used as a form of treatment. Kind of one way to think about it is electroconvulsive therapy and how that was being used. Now, Wesley himself was there are some standard jokes. You will often hear about Wesley's electric chair and his idea of inviting Methodist preachers to sort of try it out and writing on its use. As a matter of fact, he did write a book, Desideratum, that really was kind of his sort of short pamphlet, if you will. It's not a real long writing on the implications of the use of electricity in his era. I do think that we need to recognize that he really saw it primarily as a reparative for people, and it really was part of a larger agenda to provide medical advice, particularly to everyday people. That includes his writing, The Primitive Physic. Wesley was kind of intrigued by how people at the lower end of society needed their own sets of resources to provide health and healing. And I'll speak about the primitive physic for a moment. What's really fascinating about that book is, if you are to read it, it seems a little jarring at times, some of the remedies in there. It feels more like folk remedies. But Wesley is actually also incorporating in many places in the primitive physic some of what we would call the grounded research of the local medical establishment at that time, including basically the Royal Society. And so, I mean, he's conversant with contemporary medicine, but he's also trying to think about where apothecaries, for instance, might only serve the higher social class. How do you find everyday remedies that would at least approximate what the apothecaries would offer, since many of the people he was doing ministry with would be on the lower end society, would not have the funding and capability of actually affording the help of an apothecary. And there was also a lot of, and I'll use a contemporary phrase, junk medicine that was going on in that period, even by traveling medicine men, the same kind of thing you would often see in really bad Westerns in the United States from the 1950s and 1960s. But they were these people that were really circulating poor medical advice. And Wesley felt like there needed to be, through his own ministers, the capacity to really provide sound health. And so it's not surprising then that Wesley would, kind of starting in the 1740s, about the time electricity was sort of being utilized in the popular culture through the creation of what's called the Leyden jar, so that you could generate electricity and then through the use of electrodes, create an electric spark, if you will, on the person's body. It's not surprising that Wesley would at least be interested in that. Now, there have been several articles that we provided for you that really kind of talk about it. It is interesting that there's even written material by contemporary historians of science who, at one level, are less charitable. As I'm presenting it, it's more as an attempt to help the Methodist people. Many times I would say, well, it's also about proselytism. I mean, it's using something that was quite intriguing in its day, but utilizing it for the sake of bringing a religious message into the conversation. But even then, those science writers are intrigued that Wesley would be a part of it. And some have argued he was one of four of the sort of primary movers and shakers to promote this kind of electroconvulsive therapy, or electrolysis as it's called, during the 18th century. Uh, it is kind of intriguing when you begin to read his own encounter with this. So, in his journal in 1747, I'm borrowing from an article that captures this information. Here, his sort of early sort of thinking about the use of these Leyden jar electric models that, at least in 1747, were being used primarily as, well, kind of show to the rich classes. So it was a kind of novelty to kind of go and get sparked, so to speak. Not unlike science shows with static electricity with children, but this was often for the very rich to have these kinds of experiences. And hear this kind of way that he's marveling over the science and the technology of that period. So he writes, "Who can comprehend how fire lives in water and passes through it more freely than through air? How flame issues out of my finger, real flame, such as sets fire to spirits of wine. How these and many more strange phenomena arise from the turning round in a glass globe. It is all by mystery. If happily by any means God may hide pride from man." Now, that last sentence is a little bit uh, intriguing. So, what is God trying to do in the midst of this? At one level, is it that to a degree we can't know everything, so that we don't claim the full mastery over this, that we don't devolve into a kind of technological mindset of reducing everything to this? Or is it really a kind of humble reality to even just recognize that God might use this technology to create something that we cannot fully fathom? Wesley's not clear there. So you could take it either as a kind of critique of our own hubris or an invitation into, well, humble awe. Either way might be understood. And I think with Wesley, holding that tension is not a bad thing in his writing at this point. Obviously, he is very intrigued and invested in the use of this technology, and particularly to help others. So much so that by 1756, he actually is using this as a means of both providing health care, if you will, for the people called Methodists, and trying to understand its implications of how it might be health care for. So the first line here, you may found seem like it is like he's running an army, but what he is doing, what he's accounting is people are coming to partake in this treatment, and then he decides to some degree who might qualify. Is probably a better way to understand this first sentence. So Wesley writes, "I ordered several persons to be electrified who were ill of various disorders, some who found an immediate, some a gradual cure. From this time I appointed first some hours in every week, and afterward an hour in every day, wherein any that might desire it wherein any that desired it might try the virtue of this surprising medicine. 2 or 3 years afterward, our patients were so numerous that we were obliged to divide them. So part were electrified in Southwark, part at the Foundry, others near St. Paul, and the rest near the Seven Dials, different parts of the city of London. The same method we have taken ever since, and to this day, while hundreds, perhaps thousands, have received unspeakable good, I have not known one man, woman, or child who has received hurt thereby." That's an intriguing understanding of the kind of mobilizing capacity of this we might think very strange form of technology that Wesley would then employ for the sake of the people called Methodist. And it comes from a November 9th, 1756 journal entry. Wesley did obviously have to try to discern what electrical treatments could do. And I know this is a really small graph, but just bear in mind that it was kind of intriguing. So everything from what might be understood as knots in the flesh, or lameness and leprosy, or dead flesh, kind of trying to figure out ways to either clear or cure flesh and or skin diseases from that standpoint, to things like palpitation of the heart, which I could imagine, yeah, being hit by a shock wave, by an electric shock might have an implication upon one's heart, to, well, coldness in the feet, pain in the back and in the stomach, uh, rheumatism or ringworms, sciatica, shingles and sprain, excessive cramp surfeit, which means excessive eating. Yeah, a diet control methodology here, folks. Deafness, swelling of all kinds, even disordered feet that's been hurt, epilepsy, toothaches, even tumors on the scalp or the goiter, gout, and even headaches and to some degree hysterics would be, could this be a psychological treatment? I hope you hear some of these may sound fanciful. Some of these actually, when we think about electroshock treatment, um, really have been intriguing. And so one way to think about this is that would Wesley, for instance, since all of this is around the conversation of technology in the body, this is one way to think about it. Would Wesley wrestle with the use of things like deep brain stimulation or pacemakers or other types of instruments, which is one reason why in my article I use pacemakers as an example, I think is a fair question. And whether he would, in this day, take technology, particularly for reparative concerns, would he take it very seriously and incorporate it into his sort of vision, if you will, of how technology might serve the people? Now, in our class, we're going to talk a lot also about technology for enhancement and control. And I do think it would be interesting how Wesley might respond to that, though he is not afraid, again, to use things like, well, to model what used to be court sermons, if you think about that as both theological and political discourse, then turn around and publish his own sermons as a way of providing a theological resource rather than writing, say, a systematic theology or dogmatics. That he's not afraid, at least, to use certain forms to serve the Methodist people, including the prevailing technology that many people have seen mainly just for curiosity and privilege as a possible resource to everyday people and helping them on the margins of life. Now, beyond this, truthfully, when we think about Wesleyan approaches, not everyone is equally optimistic in their approach. And I've included an article by H. Ray Dunning. Yeah, it's going to seem odd. I think it's about a 1985 article. And as you're reading Dunning, actually his employ of more contemporary theological resources, which would be something Wesleyans would do. They would not merely look back to John, but begin to think about how does our current theological posture inform what's going on. You'll find that he is a little more reflective of Benjamin Brock's work and the concern of technological society and the hubris that goes with that. His example in that article I find fascinating, just to tell you, is because of the tragic explosion of the space shuttle, which I think is kind of, again, representative of our sort of reliance on progress. If you ever have an opportunity, there's been a really good documentary, actually a kind of dramatic representation of the decisions that led up to the launch of the space shuttle that is sort of fascinating. But I'll be upfront also to use something like the space shuttle as the case in point in an article by Dr. Dunning is a little bit tone deaf. It's one thing to also recognize that that particular example does represent the collective mourning of people that I've always been somewhat nervous about. But that's me. I think it is actually for that era an excellent example of the limits of science and technology from that standpoint. But I do want to encourage you to spend some time reading the work of Randy Maddox. He is a much more forceful writer in sort of thinking about Wesley's contributions over time. And I do think that Wesley reflects an intersection of science as a kind of holistic approach, and particularly for people on the margins. Let me stress that the science of Wesley's day, particularly the medical science of Wesley's day, if you were on the margins of society, you were either to some degrees barriered from the best care and susceptible to some of the worst care. Not unlike today, and for Maddox to actually even dedicate an entire volume in Wesley's works to medical and health writings just reminds us how seriously Wesley took the science and the technology of his day and trying to making it accessible to the people called Methodists and the people on the margins of life. L. Gregory Jones, writing actually for an entirely different field. So some of you know, thinking more around entrepreneurship, for instance, and recognizing that technology is a part of the warp and woof of entrepreneurial life, particularly through the use of AI and certain types of digital media right now. But true, I'm deeply mindful that actually entrepreneurs are the ones who are introducing things like electric cars, even at times reinventing um, space flight these days. The U.S. has finally returned to that again, and that might be one reason why the space shuttle might be a healthy reminder for us as we move forward. But nevertheless, L. Gregory Jones uses the language of traditioned innovation. In other words, how is it that our engagement from that standpoint still respects the deeper intent of our heritage, at least the Wesleyan heritage, as we try to innovate and use technology for the sake of today, either through communication or through health and care. Those would be things that Jones would say, how do we respect the innovation, but at the same time, situate it from within tradition and see how they dialogue with each other? My perspective, since I tend to associate with the Wesleyan tradition pretty heavily, is to acknowledge that yes, technology is always dangerous, but it also is a potential means of grace. And let me explain that a little bit more broadly for just a second. Wesley, for one way to think about Wesleyanism is to understand his commitment to what has been called the optimism of grace. Now, we often use that really over and against a Reformation view on the persistency of evil. And normally, when you hear that language, as it is the optimism of the transformation of individual persons. But I think Wesley also saw, and I think Wesleyans can see, the potential good in and through any form of technological practice and how that might make a difference. The other thing that's really important is that Wesley was very much interested in the people called Methodists, the particularity of life, and really was really more interested in how he might make a difference for those on the margins rather than merely seeing technology as a form of broad social manipulation. Um, Wesley saw life as both dangerous, but also renewable in and through God's work with specific practices and specific communities in mind. One reason in this class I tend to focus more on culture is that it allows for cultures, different ways, even particular communities might engage technology rather than a kind of broad view of social control that at times really kind of portrays technology or technological society as a very uniform kind of approach, persistency, when actually, when we consider the social order, there's normally many communities, many cultures trying to engage with technology in their own particular way. And I think paying attention to that particularity, those cultures, is really helpful. And so even as we talk about cultural themes a lot of times in our engagement between technology and theology, those themes tend to show up differently from one particular community and context or another one. And it shows us the ability for some communities to utilize technology as forms of resistance instead of capitulation, and also to utilize technology sometimes for the sake of transformation. Now, I've written on this, but I'll just say it this way, that a lot of times how we evaluate technology, to me, really includes three things. One is relationality. How does that technology connect us? How does it mirror the very relationality of the triune God and drawing people together and drawing us all into the fullness of what God offers for us? And so, where is relationality as opposed to schism, division, isolation? That becomes one of the questions I always ask. How might this technology be important from that standpoint? Also believe in contextuality, that the technology doesn't try to assume a uniform view of the world, but can be worked within very specific places in very specific ways. And it keeps the heritage and history. It doesn't strip out the very life of people in when it comes to in the history of people as that technology unfolds. And then finally, complexity, that as we engage technology, it doesn't become too reductionistic, doesn't tend to flatten things, but still reminds us of what truly is a very complex, and to go back to Wesley, mystery, a complex mystery of how and which that technology might be at work in its interrelationship. I do think that this idea of means of grace, this vision of Christian practice that provides an approach that includes, well, deep discernment, but also counterformative practices and a vision of agency that results in transformation in and through the people by the Holy Spirit. It's one way to think about the means of grace. This set of sacramental practices that sees how God might take the stuff of creation, including the technologies that emerge, and transform them if we are discerning, if we understand how we use those practices, maybe sometimes not as they were even originally intended, but in ways that help form people into a Christian vision. And as they are used, really to empower agency to bring about, well, both the transformation of individuals, but in and through the work of people, provide a transforming presence through the Holy Spirit in the world around us. Probably one person that I've mentioned a couple of times, and I'll just mention one last time, that might be a dialogue partner with a Wesleyan approach, is the writing of Kay Ott. Now, I'm not trying to lift her up as definitive, but since we're reading Brian Bach, I thought naming her here in this presentation might be helpful. Ott really writes from both a Catholic and I would say a very feminist perspective, and is calling for, she writes primarily in the digital media domain. So the communications technology domain that we've been talking about would be the primary way she sees where technology plays itself out. And she calls for a kind of digital literacy. And if you know anything about the writings within feminism, yeah, that both includes a critical assessment of digital work, but it also is inherently relational and intergenerational in its orientation, in sort of understanding the deep dynamic that requires texture and adaptiveness and flexibility. And so instead of hard ethical rules, maybe even not just one sort of virtue that governs how we approach, it really is much more fluid and adaptive from that standpoint. Now, Ott's total work is also, let me just go ahead and say this, is also in sexual ethics and feminist ethics. And there would be areas of her writing that I don't think many of you would completely agree with at all. And I want to acknowledge that. No theologian really captures everything, embodies everything that I'm trying to write and talk about. So I'm using Ott in a very limited way in which she approaches this digital sphere, if you will, of technology. And in that, she does call for the recognition for the need of a creative moral response that's anchored in kind of flexible ethical dispositions, a very probably one way to say it is a more of a virtue approach, but even a modest, where humility, to use Wesley's sort of writing, kind of humble engagement with the technology, as well as a critical engagement is necessary. Final thing I'll say about Ott is that normally, and I would say this would be true with Wesley, is that our technological practice is inevitable. We are here. We live in a society. We are engaged in technology. We do not have to accept and embrace its assumptions completely, but nevertheless, we must work from within it to bring about opportunities for honest Christian engagement in such a way that it might make a difference. And so I would say, as opposed to sort of reformed responses that often pit two kingdoms, if you will, against each other, to borrow from Luther for a moment, of the absolute sinfulness of the practices in the world and the absolute counterformative practices within the life of the church. I think Wesley would say we live within a particular world. We're called to, yes, participate within the means of grace, the historic ones that have been provided through the life of the church, including liturgy, forms of prayer, the reading of scripture, honest conversations with each other, and the Lord's Supper. But we must also be aware of how God, through God's wisdom, if you will, provides other approaches that we have to ask how they might also be means of grace as well, and to discern what that might look like. And then to actively, for the sake of others, utilize technology to bring about health, wholeness, life through these technologies. These are things that I think a Wesleyan view has to take seriously. Well, I hope this has been helpful. Let me just again caution, mainly because there are things about Ott that I really like, yet I know there will be other pieces of Ott's writing, particularly broadly, that would be troubling, which probably when a professor says that means you're going to go out and read it, right? But this is a disclaimer, but there would be things that necessarily the tradition of the Church of the Nazarene or even other Christian traditions might not equally embrace within her writing. But her work, at least in digital literacy, has been very helpful in providing an alternative view. So I did want to kind of close with that, both acknowledgement and disclaimer. But I hope, even as I've done that, that just reminds us that we need not always seek some other theological tradition. There might be, even within the Wesleyan tradition, sufficient resources to help us to navigate, if you will, what it means to engage technology through cultures, through specific communities and contexts in such a way that we might be able to see them as means of grace. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and we will see you online. Blessings.